They laughed when Geoffrey de Havilland unveiled the design. A bomber made of plywood. In 1940, with the Luftwaffe dominating the skies and German radar sniffing out British bombers every night, the British war machine needed steel, guns, and brute force. But de Havilland said no. He offered a ghost. A sleek, smooth-bodied, twin-engined machine with no defensive guns, no armour plating, and no time to waste. When he pitched the concept to the Air Ministry, one official reportedly muttered, "We asked for a lion, and he's given us a wooden deer." But de Havilland believed in two things: speed and sequence. His answer to Nazi radar wasn't more firepower, it was invisibility through velocity. And so began the first sketches of the de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito, built of Canadian spruce and birch plywood bonded with casein and urea formaldehyde glues. Its skin was so light that 2 men could lift a full wing. Yet under its bonnet sat 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same monsters that powered the Spitfire, and when they roared, the Mosquito became the fastest operational aircraft in the world. On November 25, 1940, the prototype took flight. Without a single shot fired, it shattered expectations. Top speed, 415 miles per hour at 28,000 feet, faster than the latest German interceptors. British engineers recorded it silently, slipping across radar lines that had butchered thousands of Wellingtons and Halifaxes. On that cold, grey day, standing in the drizzle at Hatfield Aerodrome, a royal observer called it the plane that hums like a cello and stings like a scorpion. But perhaps the greatest proof came when an early production model outran a Spitfire in level flight twice. Flight Lieutenant John E. Aldridge wrote in his notebook, "We chased her down the coast. She danced between the clouds like a hawk, and I lost her over Dover. Bloody hell, she was gone." The plane that wasn't supposed to exist had just humiliated the very best the RAF had to offer. In a war built on steel, Britain built a ghost from timber and glue, a machine too fast to be caught, too light to be tracked, and by 1941 the Germans would learn its name the hard way. Next comes the moment American pilots first laid eyes on it and laughed. But they weren't laughing for long. In the summer of 1942, a Royal Air Force airfield outside Northolt buzzed with visiting American crews from the newly arrived 8th Air Force. They had brought their B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-38 Lightnings, gleaming metal, 4 engines, bristling with guns. When the British ground crew rolled out a wooden twin-engine aircraft with no armament, the Americans burst out laughing. "You boys building furniture or flying it?" one pilot joked, slapping the smooth plywood wing. A British sergeant only smiled and replied, "You'll see soon enough, mate. She doesn't fight." Fair. That aircraft was the de Havilland Mosquito B Mech 4, made almost entirely from spruce, balsa and birch, yet it could reach 425 miles per hour, 30 faster than the fastest American fighter then in service. Its weight barely reached 7 tons loaded, half of a B-17. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin, 20 engines, each pushing 1,460 horsepower, made the airframe sing rather than roar. During test flights over Norfolk, the noise of its twin propellers fused into a whisper. One American mechanic, watching it streak overhead, dropped his cigarette and muttered, "That's no plane, that's witchcraft." 2 weeks later, the laughter ended. The Mosquito flew its first joint mission over France, photographing rail lines near Amiens at treetop height. German Focke-Wulf 190s scrambled to intercept, but radar never caught it. The film was on a London desk before the Luftwaffe had even filed their report. One American observer, Lieutenant Jack Donovan, wrote in his diary that night, "We came here thinking these wooden things were a joke. They move faster than thought. 1 minute she's there, next she's gone. You can't fight what you can't see." Behind the humour and disbelief lay the quiet British genius for doing more with less. They lacked aluminium, so they used wood. They lacked manpower, so they used craftsmen from furniture shops, piano makers and coach builders. What the Americans called quaint, Britain called survival. The Mosquito was not a symbol of shortage. It was proof that imagination could outfly industry. By autumn of 1942, the same Americans who had mocked it asked to train alongside its crews. They wanted to learn its tricks. But Britain wasn't done surprising them. Next came the missions that would humiliate the Nazi propaganda machine itself and prove that the wooden wonder could strike the heart of Berlin before breakfast. When the first production orders for the Mosquito rolled in, there were no vast factories waiting to build it. Britain's great metal foundries were already working at full strain, turning out Spitfires, Lancasters and tanks. So de Havilland made a decision that would rewrite the logic of industrial war. He turned to the carpenters, the furniture makers of High Wycombe, the cabinet builders of Shoreditch, the piano craftsmen of Coventry. Men whose hands once shaped dining tables and violins were now summoned to build the fastest aircraft on Earth. More than 400 British firms took part. Some fashioned wing ribs in dusty church halls. Others built fuselage moulds in disused schools. At a time when the German armament industry relied on slave labour and centralised plants vulnerable to bombing, Britain scattered production like seeds across the countryside. Each small shop was a fortress of sawdust and spirit. Workers glued, clamped and sanded their way to war. Every time a Mosquito took flight, it carried the fingerprints of hundreds of ordinary citizens who had never seen the front but fought from their workbenches. One of them, a piano craftsman named Albert Finch from Leeds, later recalled, "We built her with the same polish we gave a concert grand. You could almost hear her sing." When the first finished fuselages arrived at Hatfield for assembly, inspectors found tolerances within a hair's width of perfection. German engineers couldn't believe it. Their steel presses couldn't match the precision of British carpentry. By 1943, production was unstoppable. Over 7,700 Mosquitoes would roll out before war's end, and every single one began as wood, layered, glued, and pressed under warmth and patience. In Berlin, intelligence analysts scoffed at reports of wooden planes defeating radar. "Nonsense," one Luftwaffe officer wrote, "a plywood bomber cannot hurt the Reich." He would be proven wrong within months. The Mosquito wasn't just a weapon, it was the British spirit carved into flight. From the same hands that built cradles, coffins and pianos came a machine that would outfly empires. And as the war turned, the Germans learned that the hum of carpenters in Buckinghamshire could sound a lot like the thunder of victory. Next came the moment this wooden miracle showed the world just how fast it could strike, faster than radar, faster than fear itself. On the morning of September 25th, 1942, two Mosquito B Mokowolf bombers from No. 105 Squadron lifted off from RAF Horsham St Faith under thick grey skies. Their target, the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Norway, over 1,000 miles round trip, deep into occupied territory, and heavily defended by German radar, flak, and fighter patrols. The odds, deadly. But the plan, simplicity itself. Fly low, fly fast, hit hard, get home. The Mosquito crew streaked across the North Sea at wave-top height, barely 50 feet above the water. German coastal radar barely had time to react before the aircraft were inland, weaving between mountains at over 350 miles per hour. By the time German command scrambled fighters from Fornebu, the Mosquitoes were already overhead, dropping their bombs with surgical precision. The blast tore through the Nazi stronghold, shattering windows and Nazi confidence in equal measure. Then, as fast as they had come, they were gone, vanishing into Norwegian cloud like phantoms with wings. Back in London, the photographs arrived within hours, crisp, clear, and damning. Prime Minister Churchill reportedly muttered, "Only the British would bomb fascists and take pictures at the same time." The Oslo raid proved more than daring. It proved physics could be weaponized. The Mosquito was faster than the reaction time of enemy radar. Its cruising speed at low altitude surpassed 400 miles per hour. That was faster than most fighters could intercept, and too low for radar beams to track. German Air Marshal Josef Kamhuber admitted in a staff briefing, "We cannot stop them. They come like ghosts." And they did it all without escort, without guns, and with 2 men aboard, 1 pilot, 1 navigator. No machine guns, no armour plates. Just trust in British engineering and the ferocity of raw speed. Warrant Officer Thomas "Tommy" Baines, who flew that mission, later said, "We weren't fearless. We were faster than fear could catch us." That single raid forced the Luftwaffe to reroute fighter coverage, stretch flak batteries, and reconsider their entire defensive grid. This was no longer just a wooden aircraft. It was a weapon of time. A British invention that didn't break through enemy lines, it bent them. But the most humiliating blow to the Nazis was still to come, a strike so precise, so public, it would echo across every German radio. The Mosquito wasn't done yet. The next target was the voice of the Reich itself. January 30th, 1943. The 10th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. In Berlin, the Nazi elite had gathered for a grand radio broadcast. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, stood ready to speak at precisely 11 a.m. German radio engineers prepared the national transmission from the Haus der Rundfunks, the House of Broadcasting. The world was meant to hear the Führer's message. What they heard instead was the scream of Merlin engines overhead. At 10:59, 3 Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron roared into Berlin's airspace at full throttle. They had flown 550 miles through enemy airspace, unescorted, unnoticed, and unfazed. Their objective was surgical: disrupt the live speech, demolish the transmitter, and prove that even Hitler's voice wasn't safe from British reach. The bombs dropped just as Goebbels opened his mouth. Windows shattered, the radio signal flickered, and across Germany millions heard the sound of truth: silence. The British had struck Berlin in broad daylight with just a handful of planes. Goebbels was reportedly furious, screaming at engineers as smoke poured from the transmitter's shell. The Nazis had promised total control of the air. What they got was humiliation, served on wings of wood. Flight Lieutenant Alan Broadley, who piloted one of the bombers that day, later said, "We weren't told what was inside, just coordinates and the time to hit. It wasn't until after the war I found out we'd bombed the Nazi microphone." He flew back across the channel with the sun still low on the horizon and the scent of burning concrete trailing behind. This was no random raid. It was psychological warfare at 400 miles per hour. It told the Reich and the world that British aircraft could punch through the heart of Nazi power at will. While American heavy bombers needed squadrons of hundreds with fighter cover, Britain sent 3 wooden planes alone and won the day. After the attack, German radio crews installed underground backup systems. Goebbels never gave another live broadcast from Berlin again. A former Wehrmacht communications officer wrote in his captured notebook, "They bombed our voice. With timber and wind, they silenced us." But for Britain, this was just the warm-up. The Mosquito wasn't just bombing targets. It was outrunning interception, rewriting air doctrine, and making even the most elite German pilots question their edge. Next, the Germans would try to catch the Ghost. But no guns, no speed, no strategy could stop what they couldn't see. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe Command had issued direct orders to night fighter squadrons. Intercept and destroy the Mosquito. They called it Der Holzbomber, the wooden bomber, and feared it more than any steel behemoth in the sky. But the truth was crueler. No one could catch it. German interceptor pilots climbed into their Messerschmitt Bf 10s and Junkers Ju 88s, engines screaming toward altitude, only to find their targets gone. The Mosquito didn't need machine guns. It needed only speed and altitude, and Britain had given it both. At 37,000 feet, the Mosquito could still cruise at over 400 miles per hour, putting it out of reach of most German fighters by the time they had eyes on it. When chased, it climbed faster. When cornered, it slipped away like vapor. Even the radar-guided flak batteries couldn't track its low-level approach in time. It became the RAF's invisible dagger, not by stealth coating, but by velocity. German ace major Helmut Lent, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced night fighter commanders with over 100 kills, wrote in frustration, "We saw the shape just once, then it climbed out of reach. Our guns are useless. Our planes too slow. How can we fight what vanishes into the sky?" British crews flew with quiet confidence. No defensive turrets, no escort needed. Navigator Charles Chaz Dunning of No. 139 Squadron remembered one mission over Hamburg. "We passed 2 enemy aircraft. They didn't even react. I don't think they had time." The Mosquito's frame, built of balsa core plywood and covered in smooth doped birch, offered the radar profile of a bird. By the time it was noticed, the bombs were already falling. The Germans tried everything. Faster aircraft, new flak patterns, radar traps. But the Mosquito adapted. British engineers installed flame dampers to hide its exhaust. They adjusted flight patterns on every mission. By the end of 1943, not a single Luftwaffe pilot had successfully shot down a Mosquito on a daylight photographic reconnaissance mission. And still, it carried no guns. The plane that mocked firepower had become the most feared threat in the Reich's skies. What began as a gamble in wood now ruled the air like a ghost with a stopwatch. But the Mosquito wasn't just dominant in the dark. At night, it hunted. It destroyed. It erased German pride in the one thing they believed they owned, the night sky. And Britain was just getting started. As dusk fell over war-torn Europe, the Luftwaffe's night fighter squadrons once ruled the darkness. Searchlights combed the skies, radar stations scanned the black void, and German aces like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer claimed dozens of kills over lumbering British bombers. But by late 1943, something began to shift. German crews started vanishing mid-patrol. Their radios went silent. And across the Channel, British night fighter squadrons chalked up victories with a new kind of predator, the Mosquito NF Mach 2. Equipped with airborne interception, AI radar, and stripped for speed, the night fighter Mosquito was the ghost that hunted ghosts. RAF crews from No. 85 Squadron would take off just after sundown from Hunsdon or West Malling, their cockpits glowing red in the dark. Flying at 28,000 feet, they stalked German interceptors returning to base, silently latching onto their radar signatures and pouncing from above. A clean burst from the 420mm Hispano cannons ended the chase before it began. In March 1944 alone, Mosquito night fighters claimed over 70 Luftwaffe kills across France and Belgium. That same month, German pilot Oberleutnant Franz Wicker wrote in his diary, "We fly home and pray not to see the devil's wings. They make no sound, no light, only death." British pilots called her the Mistress of the Night because she seduced the enemy into believing they were safe, then struck like a hawk from the clouds. One such story belongs to Flight Lieutenant Roy Marston of No. 96 Squadron. On April the 12th, flying out of RAF Honolly, he intercepted a returning Ju-88 near Arnhem. He and his radar operator tracked it in total silence. At 200 yards, the moonlight hit the enemy's fuselage. Roy opened fire. One burst and he fell like a brick, he recalled. Didn't even fire back. That's when I knew the Mosquito wasn't a plane. It was a sentence. Luftwaffe Command was forced to reassign some of their best pilots from offensive missions to desperate defensive patrols. But it was no use. The Mosquito's kill ratio at night far exceeded any comparable aircraft on either side. By the end of 1944, the RAF's Mosquito night fighter squadrons had claimed over 600 confirmed kills. No longer just a bomber or a recon plane, the Mosquito had become an executioner in the darkness. The Germans had lost control of the night. And worse, the British had done it with elegance, precision, and a cockpit lit by red glow and cold tea. The war was shifting, and now the Mosquito was about to show the world that it didn't need to choose a single role, because it could do everything. By the winter of 1944, even hardened RAF veterans struggled to count all the roles the Mosquito had mastered. It was a bomber, a night fighter, a pathfinder, a reconnaissance platform, a torpedo raider, and an electronic warfare ghost. In a war where most aircraft were designed for one task and barely did that well, the Mosquito shattered every rule. It flew lower than a Stuka, higher than a Mustang, faster than a Focke-Wulf, and could outclimb almost anything with wings. The Americans had their heavy hitters, the B-17, the P-51D, but each one came with weight, complexity, and a specific job. The British didn't have the luxury of time or material. What they had was a plane made of wood, and the will to use it for everything. When Bomber Command needed eyes on Peenemünde before the first strike, they sent a Mosquito. When SOE needed leaflets dropped across occupied France, they called a Mosquito. When naval intelligence needed German shipping harassed in the Bay of Biscay, it was again the Mosquito that dove between waves with 500-pound bombs tucked under her wings. In March 1944, during the raid on the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, 3 Mosquitoes from No. 464 Squadron RAAF led the attack, weaving between buildings at rooftop height to strike precisely at noon. In one cockpit sat Flying Officer Peter Jones, barely 21 years old. His plane delivered the opening blast that blew open the courtyard, just seconds before resistance prisoners were scheduled for execution. The mission lasted under 6 minutes. Every target was destroyed. Not a single civilian died. Peter would later tell his wingman, "We flew through stone and shadows. I never looked at buildings the same again." The Mosquito carried not just bombs, but messages. It told occupied nations that the British could strike anywhere, anytime, with elegance and accuracy. It told the Germans that their most secure facilities were not safe. It told America that raw mass wasn't the only path to victory. A captured German technician in Rouen, interviewed in early 45, simply said, "We tried to build planes for power. The British built theirs like knives." From Norway to North Africa, from the Pyrenees to Prague, the Mosquito proved that one plane could rewrite how war was fought. It wasn't just doing many jobs, it was doing them better than any other aircraft. But next, the Wooden Wonder would do the impossible, launch a raid so precise, so low, and so human that even the SS would be caught unprepared. February 18th, 1944. At exactly 11:29 in the morning, the ground trembled near Amiens prison in German-occupied France. Within minutes, walls that had stood for centuries cracked open like eggshells. British-built Mosquitoes had just pulled off one of the most daring raids in history, low, fast, and timed to the second. The mission wasn't to destroy, but to free Ouchy, to punch a hole through stone and tyranny and give French resistance prisoners one last chance to live. The operation was codenamed Jericho. 16 Mosquitoes from No. 487 Squadron RNZAF and No. 464 Squadron RAAF under RAF control, flew from Hunsdon at treetop height. Their objective: break open Amiens prison, kill key German guards, and allow over 100 resistance members scheduled for execution to escape. Each aircraft carried two 500-pound bombs. The route was drawn to the inch. Their altitude, often less than 30 feet. Trees blurred, fences vanished, farmhouses shook as the planes skimmed past. Flight Lieutenant Max Prusner led the first wave. At 11:27, he dropped the first bomb on the outer wall. 2 minutes later, a second strike collapsed the main cell block. Dust rolled like fog across the snow-covered fields. SS guards fired wildly into the smoke, but it was too late. Prisoners were already running, some barefoot, others wounded, all tasting air they never thought they'd breathe again. Out of the 120 prisoners targeted, 70 managed to flee. Some were caught. Others made it to the woods and joined local partisan cells. One inmate, Jean-Luc Moreau, later recalled, "I heard thunder, saw light, and then freedom opened in front of me. The British didn't just bomb a prison. They tore a hole in fate." Not a single Mosquito was lost to enemy fire. The Germans couldn't react in time. Radar couldn't track them. The flak guns were pointed the wrong way. Even the feared SS response teams were minutes too slow. For the first time in the war, the Nazis learned that not even their walls could stand against British wood, glue, and resolve. The success of Operation Jericho shocked even the Allies. American planners reportedly studied the mission with disbelief. How did Britain pull off such precision with a bomber made of plywood? The answer wasn't in steel or speed alone. It was in planning, courage, and trust in a plane that had already become legend. But the legend was still growing. Now the numbers would start to speak, and what they revealed would shake the myth of German superiority. Because the Mosquito wasn't just brilliant, it was built in numbers that would overwhelm the Reich's dreams. By late 1944, the Reich was crumbling, but not for the reasons Hitler feared most. It wasn't just Allied troops pressing in from the beaches or Red Army tanks rolling west. It was the whisper of twin Merlin engines in the cold night air. It was the hum of a wooden shadow, slipping past radar and rewriting the rules of warfare. It was the British Mosquito, produced faster, flown harder, and feared deeper than any aircraft its size in the war. The numbers told the story no propaganda could bury. Britain built 7,781 Mosquitoes between 1941 and the war's end. Every variant, bomber, night fighter, photo recon, fighter bomber, poured out of converted furniture shops, piano factories, and quietly humming aerodromes across the Isles. By contrast, Germany's most advanced multi-role night fighter, the Heinkel He-219, saw just 294 produced, strangled by infighting, steel shortages, and Allied bombing. While the Luftwaffe clung to expensive, complex prototypes, Britain let its carpenters build the warhorse of the skies. At one point, production was so efficient that a completed Mosquito rolled out every 22 minutes from the de Havilland plant at Leavesden. That's faster than it took to boil a pot of tea on most Home Guard stoves. Entire squadrons were re-equipped in days, not months. Captured Luftwaffe mechanic Otto Kruger, interviewed in a POW camp outside Liverpool, remarked bitterly, "We spent 3 weeks fitting one radar set into a Junkers. You lot built 5 planes in that time, out of wood." His words weren't exaggeration. While Germany obsessed over Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons, Britain mass-produced a miracle already flying. The Mosquito's versatility meant it didn't need backup. In a single mission, it could photograph enemy terrain, drop bombs with surgical precision, then strafe the return path. all before breakfast. American generals called it the most efficient airframe ever built. German intelligence reports simply labelled it untrackable. And still, it was powered by just 2 engines. The same Merlin power plants found in the Spitfire, but now harnessed in a lighter, faster, more agile airframe. The Germans had built monsters with 4 engines, 8 guns and steel by the ton, but they couldn't outfly a British piano maker's dream. With every mission, every sortie, every silent blur across a night sky, Britain wasn't just winning battles, it was rewriting air power itself. But if American brass now respected the Mosquito, they still hadn't felt what it meant to fly alongside one. That would change next. When a seasoned American pilot finally rode with the RAF, he walked away with a new story and a confession. Captain Lewis M. Frost had flown over 60 combat missions in his P-47 Thunderbolt by the time he stepped onto the tarmac at RAF Hunsdon in March 1945. A decorated American fighter ace, Frost carried the swagger of a man used to leading squadrons into flak and fire. But on this day, he wasn't flying American steel. He was assigned to observe a special RAF sortie as part of inter-allied coordination. And his chariot was a British Mosquito FB Mk6. When he saw the plane, his first words were, "Where's the rest of it?" The smooth, gunless nose, the polished wooden fuselage, no armour plating, no rear gunners. It looked, as he later put it, like something built to race, not fight. But 20 minutes after liftoff, roaring low over the Rhine Valley at 300 feet, his opinion changed with every second. The pilot, Flight C, Lieutenant Harry Balfour, didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The Mosquito did the talking. It banked under power lines, skimmed the tops of German convoy trucks, then kicked into a climb so steep Frost had to grab the edge of his seat. The target, a fuel depot near Kassel, appeared ahead, but the Mosquito didn't strafe from afar. It dove, screamed in at treetop level, dropped 2 500-pounders within 12 feet of the supply tanks, and was gone before the smoke even began to rise. Back on the airstrip, Frost stood silent for a minute, helmet still under his arm. Then he said the words that later made it into the RAF's internal newsletter. "I used to laugh at the wooden wonder. Now I'd trade 2 squadrons of Thunderbolts for one of these." The quote spread fast. American crews who'd once chuckled in mess halls started requesting training slots with RAF squadrons. Some even volunteered to fly second seat. Frost wrote home that week, "It moves like it's alive. I've never seen a plane do what that plane just did." That confession, from a man who'd survived the skies over Normandy and Sicily, echoed louder than any boast. The British had built something so fast, so agile, so complete, that even their allies fell silent. But there was still one more number that sealed the Mosquito's legacy. A statistic that historians would later say helped end the war faster than any single Allied machine. And that number? It wasn't measured in bomb loads or kills, but in months. Months of war it erased with speed, precision, and the will of a nation that turned wood into victory. By the final spring of the war, German command wasn't just losing battles, they were losing time. Entire weeks vanished as British Mosquitoes struck faster, deeper, and more often than any strategic forecast had predicted. In a war measured in inches and minutes, the Mosquito carved hours off missions, days off campaigns, and, by some estimates, as much as 6 months off the war itself. From late 1943 onward, Mosquito squadrons operated almost without pause. Flying over occupied France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, Italy, and even as far east as Czechoslovakia, they hit more than 1,000 high-value targets with surgical precision. Their speed and accuracy eliminated the need for large bomber groups and reduced collateral damage by a scale that historians would later call tactically revolutionary. German transport hubs were crippled. Radar stations were shattered. Ammunition trains vanished in fireballs, all struck by crews that were back in England before lunch. One mission in particular, flown on April 3, 1945, struck the shell house in Copenhagen, a Gestapo headquarters, while avoiding a nearby school by less than 100 yards. Not a single child was injured. The raid took just 11 minutes. Major Hans Bauer, a German officer captured days later, reportedly told his interrogator, "We used to prepare for bombers, but the Mosquito, it came before the alarm. By the time we heard it, it was already over." Historians reviewing post-war archives began connecting the dots. Had the Mosquito not eliminated so many enemy installations ahead of D-Day? Had it not disrupted V-weapon development sites? Had it not crippled German command infrastructure? The war would have dragged on, bled more men, and delayed Allied advances by months. The final estimation, published years later in a British air doctrine analysis, read simply, "The Mosquito shortened the war in Europe by no less than 6 months." 6 months. 180 days of fighting, bombing, death and resistance. Gone. Erased by a plane made from plywood and glue, flown by men in flight suits, stitched with patches and prayer. It was the only plane in the war that served in every command: bomber, fighter, coastal, reconnaissance, pathfinder, night fighter. No other aircraft touched every theatre, every front, every role, and dominated each one. Britain didn't just build a machine, it built an answer to tyranny, to delay, to doubt. From the factories of Hatfield to the farms of Norfolk, from the piano shops of Camden to the blast craters of Berlin, the Mosquito flew faster than fear, harder than hate, and longer than any shadow the Reich could cast. And all from a nation whose strength wasn't in numbers or steel, but in courage, craft, and the quiet confidence that speed, when paired with will, could end a war.